In 1894, a French archaeologist working a site near the ancient city of Nippur unearthed something he could not understand. The object was a clay tablet, fired hard, dense as a brick, but it was wrong. The size was wrong, the shape was wrong, and when he held it up to the light, he could feel something inside it. It was an envelope tablet. The Sumerians made these. They would write an outer message on a clay shell, then seal a second tablet inside, hidden like a letter inside an envelope made of stone. The outer surface of this one carried a temple inventory, sheep counts, barley measurements, the kind of unremarkable accounting that no one would think twice about. Whoever made it wanted exactly that reaction. They wanted the tablet ignored. The archaeologists sent it back to Paris. It sat in a museum drawer for 71 years. And in 1965, a curator finally cracked it open. What was inside was not an inventory. It was not a list of sheep. It was not anything the Sumerians were supposed to be writing. It was 12 numbered passages. Each one began with the same opening phrase, which translates roughly to, "The work of the Lord of the Secret Waters." The Lord of the Secret Waters has a name. His name is Enki. And the 12 passages describe something Enki did to early humanity that he never told the rest of his council about. They describe an experiment, the last one he ran before they caught him. And in the final passage, the tablet states what happened to the humans he experimented on, which would be interesting on its own, except for one specific detail buried in the closing line. According to the tablet, we are their descendants, not their cousins, not their distant relatives, their direct line. The ones still carrying what he gave them, even if we have no idea what it is or what it was meant to do. The man who finally translated all 12 passages spent the rest of his career trying to publish the document and was blocked every time by the institutional review board that controlled the tablet. He died in 1989. The tablet, as far as anyone can confirm, is still sealed in a private vault in Switzerland under a non-disclosure agreement that expires in 2041. But before he died, the translator photocopied his notebook and gave it to a former student, who sat on it for 30 years, and then quietly began circulating the contents within a small group of researchers. That is how the 12 codes came to exist outside the vault. And what they describe is not a creation story. It is not a fled story. It is not anything anyone has heard before. It is a description of the last thing Enki did to us before the rest of the Anunnaki Council found out, and the consequences are still unfolding in our bodies, in our dreams, and in the way certain humans, only certain ones, keep waking up in the middle of the night with their hearts pounding and a name they do not recognize on their lips. To understand why this tablet matters, you have to understand what Enki was, according to the Sumerians. He was not just a god, he was the engineer. The Anunnaki Council had created a working population of humans, generations earlier, primarily as a labor force for mining and infrastructure. Enki was the one who designed them. He was also the one who, on multiple occasions in the surviving texts, broke ranks with his own council to protect them. He warned a human named Zeus Sudra about a coming flood when the council had decided to let the humans drown. He gave humans knowledge that was supposed to remain exclusive to the gods. He had what the Sumerians, with their typically blunt vocabulary, described as a soft spot for his own creation. The other Anunnaki noticed. His brother Enlil, in particular, did not approve. Enlil wanted humanity kept on a short leash. Enki kept undoing the leash. What this tablet describes is the final time he did it, the last project. The one he ran in secret because he knew if the council found out, they would order it reversed and probably kill the test subjects to be sure. And so he did it in a hidden chamber, in a city the council rarely visited, with a small group of humans selected for a single trait that the tablet identifies in Code 3. The translator's name, the one that was eventually scrubbed from most of the institutional records, was Henri Lavoie. He had been a researcher at the Louvre's cuneiform department since 1962. He was 34 years old when the tablet was finally opened. By the time he finished translating it, he was 78. His apartment in the 16th arrondissement, neighbors later said, had not been changed in any significant way for 40 years. The same desk, the same lamp, the same photographs on the same shelves. The only thing that changed was the stack of notebooks on the desk, which grew year after year, as he worked his way through the 12 passages, one by one, refusing to publish anything until he understood all of them. He never married, he had no children. He left everything, including the notebooks, to a former student named Margot, who had worked under him in the early 1980s, and who, by the time he died, had moved to Geneva and stopped responding to academic correspondence. Code 1 identifies the location. It does not name the city directly. Instead, it gives a coordinate based on the position of a specific star against the horizon at sunrise on a specific day of the Sumerian calendar. When researchers ran the astronomical math backward, the coordinate resolved to a point about 8 kilometers outside the ruins of Eridu, which the Sumerians considered Enki's primary city. The point is not on the surface. The tablet specifies a depth of approximately 30 meters, underground, below the water table, in a chamber that, according to the passage, was carved out of bedrock by a method the scribe describes as the cutting that does not heat the stone. That phrase has been debated for decades. It is the kind of detail that, when you sit with it, starts to feel less like metaphor and more like a description of something the Sumerians genuinely could not explain. Code 2 describes the subject pool, 200 humans, selected from a much larger population. The tablet does not say what the larger population was, but it was likely the laboring population of Eridu in the tens of thousands at that period. The 200 were chosen, the passage says, not for strength or intelligence, but for what the scribe calls the open ear of the sleeping mind, which, in plain translation, means people who dreamed vividly, people who remembered their dreams, people who, in modern terminology, would probably be described as having a particular kind of neurological sensitivity. Enki was looking for receptive subjects, not strong ones, not smart ones, receptive. Code 3 is where the experiment begins. The passage describes what Enki did to the 200. It uses the word that gets translated as modification, but the underlying root is more specific than that. It carries the sense of adding something rather than altering something. He did not change what was already in them. He added a second layer. The passage describes it as the second strand woven into the first, that the first might hear what was not spoken. Genetic researchers who have looked at this passage have noted that the language is uncannily compatible with a description of inserting additional genetic material into an existing organism. Whether the Sumerians could have understood that concept on their own is a question that has no good answer. But the description is there, in clay, dated to roughly 2400 BC. Code 4 describes the first effect. After the modification, the 200 began to dream differently, not just vividly, specifically. They began to dream of places they had never been, in detail they could not have invented. They dreamed of rooms inside structures none of them had ever entered. They dreamed of faces of people none of them had ever met. And, most importantly, they began to dream the same things. Not similar things, the same things. 2 subjects, sleeping in different parts of the chamber, would wake with identical dreams. The same room, the same face, the same words spoken in the dream. Code 5 describes what happened when they were awake. The dreams began to leak. The 200 began to hear, while conscious, a quiet voice that none of them recognized as their own. The passage does not say the voice was Enki. It says the voice came from the place where Enki had laid his hand, which suggests Enki had installed a channel, a line of communication that did not require him to be present for it to function. The voice told them practical things at first. Where to walk to avoid a snake, which water to drink, which person was lying. The 200 began, very quickly, to outperform their peers. They lived longer, they lost fewer children. They became, in their small community, conspicuous. Code 6 describes what Enki gave them next. He gave them what the passage calls the gift of the seeing before, foreknowledge. The 200 began to anticipate events before the events occurred. Floods, raids, the death of a family member 3 days before it happened, the arrival of a stranger at the door an hour before they arrived. The capacity came in pulses, but when it came, it was accurate. The scribe writes that the 200 would sometimes pause in the middle of an ordinary task, freeze, and then quietly begin preparing for something no one else could yet see coming. By the second generation, the 200 had become 2000 because the modification was hereditary. By the third generation, they were a recognizable subpopulation inside Eridu, a bloodline the rest of the city had begun to fear. Code 7 describes what Enki gave the third generation. This is where the document begins to shift in tone. The earlier passages describe Enki working carefully, almost surgically. Code 7 describes him expanding the experiment in a way that suggests he was running out of time. He gave the third generation what the passage calls the long memory, the capacity to remember not just their own lives but the lives that came before them. The scribe describes a child of the third generation, 4 years old, sitting up in the night and describing in detail the death of a man she had never met, who had died 60 years earlier in a city she had never visited. The child described the man's clothing, his final words, the faces of the people standing around his bed. Then she went back to sleep, calm. The keepers wrote it down and confirmed every detail against the temple records. Every detail was correct. Code 8 describes the side effect Enki had not anticipated. The third generation began to recognize each other. They could walk through a crowd and identify another member of the bloodline by sight, not by appearance, by something else. The scribe uses a word that translates roughly to the same fire behind the eyes. They were drawn to each other. They sought each other out. And once they found each other, they began to do something that the keepers of the experiment had not authorized and could not control. They began to remember Enki, not as a god, as a person. As the man who had put his hand on their grandparents and given them what they now carried. They knew his face. They knew his voice. They knew the room he had stood in when he ran the original modification. None of them had ever seen any of these things. But they all knew. And when a member of the third generation walked past the temple of Enki in Eridu, the keepers reported that the member would stop, place a hand on the outer wall, and stand there in silence for several minutes, as if listening to something inside. Code 9 is the passage that, according to the translator's notes, took him 11 years to render into English. It is the longest of the 12. It contains a number. And the number is what has kept this tablet in a Swiss vault for 30 years. The number is 44 million. That is what Code 9 says the experiment grew to by the time Enki's brother Enlil discovered what was happening. 44 million carriers of the modification, spread across the population of Mesopotamia and beyond, over a period of approximately 600 years. Enki had not been running a small hidden experiment. He had been seeding a population. He had been building, quietly and patiently, a parallel humanity that carried something the standard humans did not. And Code 9 specifies, in its final lines, the trigger conditions under which that parallel humanity would, in Enki's design, fully activate. The trigger conditions are tied to a specific astronomical alignment, a specific population density, and a specific event the tablet describes only as the arrival of the second voice. We do not know what the second voice is. The translator left a note in the margin of his notebook on this passage. The note reads, "I believe we are close to the conditions now." Code 10 describes the discovery. Enlil found out. The passage does not say how. It says only that the discovery came from the mouth of a keeper who could no longer carry the silence. One of Enki's own people, one of the humans helping him run the experiment, broke. They went to Enlil and described everything. The chamber, the 200, the modification, the 44 million, the trigger conditions. Enlil, according to the passage, did not react the way anyone expected. He did not destroy the carriers. He did not order them killed. He sat in silence for what the scribe describes as the length of 3 meals. And then he did something stranger. He went to find Enki. Code 11 describes the meeting between the brothers. They met, the passage says, on neutral ground, in a chamber neither of them controlled, with no witnesses except the scribe, who later wrote the passage down. We do not know how the scribe was present. The conversation is not reproduced in detail. The passage gives only the outcome. Enlil did not order the experiment reversed. Enlil did not order the carriers destroyed. Enlil ordered the experiment hidden. He ordered the chamber sealed. He ordered the keepers killed, every one of them, to prevent the knowledge from spreading. And he ordered Enki to never speak of it again, to anyone, including the rest of the council. Enlil, the brother who had always wanted humans on a short leash, decided that this particular leash had become too dangerous to cut. Whatever Enki had built, Enlil concluded, was now bigger than the council's ability to contain. The best Enlil could do was bury it and hope it stayed buried. Code 12 is the final passage. It describes what the carriers were supposed to do in Enki's original design. When the trigger conditions arrived, they were supposed to begin remembering, not the small fragments the third generation had been remembering, the full sequence, the reason they were made, the thing they were made to do. The passage describes this final stage of activation in language that has been argued over for decades because the underlying word can be translated three different ways. It can mean to wake up, it can mean to return home, or it can mean, most disturbingly, to open the door for the one who is coming. The translator, in his notes, believed the third translation was the correct one. He believed Enki had built the carriers not as a gift to humanity, but as a key that would unlock something when the conditions were right. And he believed Enlil had buried the experiment because Enlil, despite all his hostility toward humans, had realized that what Enki had built was a door, and Enlil did not know what was on the other side of it. That is the end of the 12 codes. The rest of the document is the translator's analysis. He spent the last decade of his life trying to determine three things. First, whether the tablet was genuine or whether it was a clever forgery produced sometime in the medieval period to discredit some rival school of esoteric thought. Second, if it was genuine, whether the experiment described in it had any continuing reality, or whether it was a piece of mythology dressed up as a technical document. And third, if the experiment was real, whether the trigger conditions Enki had specified were anywhere near being met in the present day. On the first question, the translator concluded the tablet was genuine. The clay was tested. The cuneiform style was consistent with the late Sumerian period. The internal grammar was archaic in exactly the ways it should have been if it had been written when the outer envelope claimed it was written. No forger of any period would have made the grammar that precise. On the second question, he concluded the experiment had a basis in something real, though he could not say with confidence what that real thing was. He noted in his journal that the bloodline description in Code 8 matched, with surprising accuracy, the genetic markers found in a specific haplogroup that emerged in the ancient Near East around the right historical period and spread outward from there into Europe, Central Asia, and beyond. The haplogroup carries no known dramatic phenotypic effects, but it is present, today, in roughly 500 million people worldwide. The translator did not believe in coincidences of that scale. On the third question, he was less certain. He noted that the astronomical alignment specified in Code 9 corresponded to a configuration of stars and planets that occurs only once every several thousand years. The next occurrence, according to his calculations, falls in the present century. He did not specify the exact year in his notes. He wrote only that the conditions were approaching and approaching faster than I expected. He also noted the population density requirement. 8 billion humans, broadly distributed across the planet, with a sufficient concentration of carriers to allow the second voice to be heard across the distributed network of the bloodline. He observed in his final journal entry that humanity had crossed 8 billion in 2022. He observed that the astronomical window opens within the present century. He observed that he did not know what the second voice was, but that he suspected we would find out soon, and that the carriers, the ones who had been waking up in the middle of the night with names they did not recognize on their lips, were the early warning system. The translator died in 1989. He did not get to see the population cross 8 billion. He did not get to see the astronomical window open. He did not get to find out what the second voice was. But his student, the one who circulated the document 30 years later, included a note of her own at the end of the file. The note is brief. It reads, "I have, in the last 6 months, been contacted by 17 people who have described to me, without prompting, dreams that match Code 6 in specific detail. None of them have read the document, none of them know each other. I do not know what this means." But the rate of contact is increasing. The student's note continues for several paragraphs beyond what most of the circulating copies contain. In the longer version, she describes the 17 contacts in more detail. They came from 9 countries. They ranged in age from 12 to 73. None of them had any connection to each other, and none of them had any prior interest in Sumerian texts or ancient astronaut theory. They had simply, in the last 6 months, begun having the same dream. The dream is always the same in its core elements. There is a room. The room has a low ceiling and walls made of something that looks like polished bronze. There is a figure standing at the far end of the room, his back turned. The figure is wearing what one contact described as the robe of someone who has been waiting a very long time. When the dreamer enters the room, the figure does not turn around. He speaks instead without facing them. The words are always different. The voice is always the same. And in every case, the dreamer wakes immediately after the figure finishes speaking, with the words still ringing in their ears, and with the absolute certainty that the figure was not a dream. The figure, the dreamers all insist, knew they were there. He had been expecting them, and he was not happy about how long they had taken to arrive. There is a final detail that the document does not address, but that several independent researchers have raised since. If Enki built the carriers as a key, and if Enlil sealed the chamber to keep the door closed, the question is not whether the door is opening now. The question is, who is on the other side? Enki, in the passages, is described as having designed the experiment in collaboration with someone. The Sumerian word for this collaborator is partially damaged in the inner tablet. The first half of the word is preserved. The second half is missing. The first half reads, in transliteration, Nin. There are several Sumerian deities whose names begin with that prefix. None of them are good candidates for the collaborator described. None of them, the translator wrote in his final marginal note, fit the silhouette of what Enki was working with. He believed, based on context, that the collaborator was not on the council. He believed the collaborator was not Anunnaki at all. He believed the collaborator was something else, and that whatever it was had given Enki the design and asked him to install it in the population, quietly, against the council's wishes, and that the trigger conditions were the agreed-upon moment at which the door would open and the collaborator would arrive. The translator died before he could finish that line of reasoning. The tablet is in a vault. The carriers, if they are real, are walking among us, going to work, raising children, occasionally waking up in the middle of the night with their hearts pounding and a name on their lips that they do not recognize and cannot forget. The astronomical window is open. The population has crossed the threshold. The keepers were killed 4,000 years ago to prevent this knowledge from spreading. The brothers buried it together. And tonight, somewhere, a child of the bloodline is going to sit up in bed at 3 in the morning, look at a corner of her bedroom that is empty, and ask her mother who the man is who keeps standing there. The mother will not see him, but the child will, because the child has the second strand. The child has the open ear. The child has the long memory. And the child is starting to remember the room she has never been in, and the face she has never seen, and the voice she has never heard, and the work of the Lord of the secret waters, who is finally, after 4,000 years of silence, beginning to speak again.